So the main goal of all of these displays is to start looking at the distribution of our variable. And the distribution is basically the shape of our data values. Like, what do they look like? How are they falling? What do we expect, right? And there's three pieces to this. One is the center of our distribution. What is the most common outcome? What do we what is our expectation? If I'm going to roll a pair of dice, what do I expect? The second piece is spread. Okay, so I have an expectation, but how realistic is that expectation? Is it really likely that it's going to be 7, or is it just kind of likely that it's going to be 7? What are the different possibilities? So that's spread. The last is our shape. Well, if 7 is the most popular outcome, are the next outcomes 5 and 6 and 8, are they equally likely, or is there a slant towards the higher numbers or a slant towards the lower? What does it look like? So there's actually 3 different aspects to shape that we're going to get to in a second. But for now, we're just going to try to break down what we notice about these 3 things with just this definition for those spring exam scores. So for those spring exam scores, if we started to look at, say, the center of our distribution, the most basic thing you could do to look at center for a distribution is to look at the mode. What happens most often? So these 2 bars are particularly large. So it appears that the majority of students scored well, right? If we went with the overall mode, the largest group of students actually scored over 100. Because I don't want to write that down, I'm just going to be a little more vague about this. I'm going to say most students, or how about a large number of students the most common outcome, right, scored 80 or more. All right, so that's something that makes us feel good as students. We're going, all right, awesome. If the majority of students, the most common outcomes were a B and higher, I feel good and stoked going into this exam. But the spread tempers that a little bit, because if you look at the spread, well, sure, this was a huge section, especially you might even want to include the 70. There's a huge chunk of people passing. We had a lot of variability, right? Students scored all the way down to the last section, all the way up to these highest scores as well. So the simplest way to look at spread is to talk about the range. And in this case, our scores range from a 0 to 10. And unfortunately, we can't say for certain whether it was a 0, a 5. We have no idea. We just know it's in this category and that we're going to go up to something over 100. So we had a student score basically no points all the way up to over 100%, right? That's how I'm thinking as a student. I'm going, okay, well, that's a little bit scarier. Everything is possible. We had students score in every single section of this particular graph. I will tell you, as I've actually seen the data, the range was actually 0 to 110, which was a perfect score. And like I told some of my students, the 110 should have been over here. I just moved it over to make this look a little less generous than what it was. And the last piece is shape. And we're going to get a more concrete definition of shape in a moment. But for right now, we'll just look at these questions that were in the thing above. Are there any unusual observations? Well, we could say it's unusual that we had so many really high scores, but we just said those scores were common. So we usually don't want to talk about unusual in that realm of like, it might be unusual because we don't usually see scores that high, but we're thinking more in terms of the distribution. So this was pretty typical. Everything here is typical. The further we get away from that typical area, our center, the more unusual things are. So we might talk about an unusual observation. Oh, whoa, it says usual. Crap. Gotta make some typos there. I gotta fix that. So unusual observations. Unusual. We might say that 0 to 10 seems pretty unusual. How in the heck could you go on the test and only score between 0 and 10 points? We actually found out the student got a 0. They didn't come. But for now, we're kind of confused. We're going, what's going on? Does it appear like more people have values in the lower end or higher end or middle of the range? Well, we'd say most people scores were in the higher range. So even though most of them were in the higher range, we still had all these students over here. So let's get a little more technical with how we can describe this shape.